Welcome to the 6th edition of our summer series, Throwback Thursdays. This is our final one of the summer. But I want to get to our main event tonight, and that is with historian Alison Rose Jefferson. She's a third-generation Californian. Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson is a historian and heritage conservation consultant. Her research interests explore the intersection of American history and African-American experience in California, historical memory, spatial justice, cultural tourism, with an aim to engage broad audiences through applied history projects and the struggle for social justice. Her book, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, which was published by University of Nebraska Press in 2020, rethinks the significance of leisure and public space for all within the long freedom rights struggle. She's currently working on public history projects related to the historical African-American experience during the Jim Crow era, including the research and narrative production for Santa Monica's Belmar History and Art Project and the Central Avenue Heritage Trail with Angels Walk LA. Her work has garnered attention in KCET LA programming, the Los Angeles and New York Times, and CBS LA and KTLA News programs, among other media outlets. You can learn more about Dr. Jefferson's work at her website, AlisonRoseJefferson.com. We are honored tonight to have Dr. Alison Rose Jefferson.
Thank you so much, John, and the rest of the museum for, Rob and the rest of the museum staff for inviting me to make a presentation today about my book and about some of the contemporary things that are happening with the history from my book. Okay, so as you know, as you've learned today, my new book is called Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. The book examines the local stories of African-Americans who fought for equal access to California's recreation and relaxation offerings as they contributed to the broader U.S. freedom rights struggle during the nation's Jim Crow era. Leisure was not an optional add-on to civil rights, but an essential component of liberty. I examine how African Americans made history in what has been called the frontier of leisure in their attempts to create communities and business projects in conjunction with their growing population in Southern California. At these sites that I discuss in the book, I illuminate the history of the development of leisure at California's African-American oceanfront and inland recreation and relaxation destinations that flourished from the 1900s to the 1960s. In contrast to the city where Black Angelenos lived, California waterfront and pastoral places were where they went to relax and invest in real estate. And these places in Los Angeles County included Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach, which is sometimes controversially called the Inkwell, and Eureka Villa in Santa Clarita Valley. Lake Elsinore and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club in Riverside County are other sites I look at, and a few others. Now today, I'm going to focus more on the historical beach culture history of African Americans in Santa Monica. African Americans were able to build a sustained community in the city of Santa Monica, founded in the 1880s, a few blocks from the Pacific shoreline in the environs of what today is the southern area of the Civic Center and Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African American church established in the city. A short way south was a Venice neighborhood, which was also part of this Santa Monica African American community. Seduced by the oceanfront resort town's offerings, African American pioneers arrived seeking their California and American dreams in Santa Monica during the late 19th century. Escaping from the worst of Jim Crow racist anti-Black discrimination laws and practices in the US South, African Americans sought enjoyment of the climate and new life opportunities afforded by California. Some of the early African American residents and important businesses, such as La Bonita Bathhouse and Cafe, were located in the South Santa Monica neighborhoods near the Civic Center. These businesses provided African Americans and other marginalized groups with accommodations, particularly when they came to enjoy the Pacific Ocean shoreline a few blocks away. The African American hangout spot at the beach was first around Pico Boulevard, and then beginning in the mid-1920s, it moved south to Bay Street after the private Casa del Mar and other beach clubs catering to a white clientele were constructed. In the years surrounding the beginnings of Phillips Chapel in 1908 at 4th and Bay Streets, the oceanfront area down the hill around Pico, south a few blocks to Bicknell Avenue, emerged as a gathering place where African Americans from all over Los Angeles County came to enjoy the beach's pleasures. While the boundaries shifted through time, it was a popular beach destination for African Americans from the 1900s to 1960s. Many of these beachgoers once referred to this stretch of coastline as the Bay Street Beach. There were some that called it the Inkwell. The latter was most certainly derogatory and first used by whites, referring to the skin color of the beachgoers. Some African Americans reclaimed the name and used it as a badge of pride. Some who went to this beach never used this name, and in contemporary times, there are people who still would prefer the name not be used. Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church and the families of the Stouts, the Lawsons, the McCarrolls, the Brunsons, the Reeses, the Tabors, the Gordons, the Maxwells, and others formed the Santa Monica community that played an important role in drawing African Americans from across the Southern California region and beyond for recreation and relaxation at this beach. Accessibility by streetcar near a thriving African American community centered around Phillips Chapel and Black-owned businesses, this beach gathering place with La Bonita and other guest houses, eating places, tennis courts, volleyball nets, and other recreational opportunities became a place of refuge and community formation. In 1922, a group of African American investors led by prominent attorney Charles S. Darden, who was also a resort developer at Lake Elsinore, and businessman Norman O. Houston, who would go on to become a founder of Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company. They sought to develop a first-class resort along the oceanfront at Pico Boulevard. The plan was met with protests from white residents and businessmen. Santa Monica city officials blocked the development from happening. After the Black investment group abandoned its plans, the property was purchased by white developers. The white group's plans for resorts were approved, and the iconic Casa del Mar Beach Club, now a hotel, and the Edgewater, now the hotel shutters on the beach, were built before 1930. Even with this and other new construction, African Americans kept their hold on the public beach space, although they were pushed further south. They were able to avoid overtly physical hostile discrimination at this area as it evolved from the edge to the center of public activity. While racial discrimination, in particular racist restrictive covenants, prevented African Americans from buying property throughout the urban region, their community's presence and agency sustained their public space usage at the oceanfront in Santa Monica. This and other Southern California leisure spaces marked an African American identity on the regional landscape and social space as they confronted the emergent power politics of leisure space and set the stage for these sites as places for remembrance of invention and public contest. The city of Santa Monica's 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church set the stage in 2008 for official recognition with a cultural monument of the historic African American gathering place at Bay Street and Oceanfront Walk. Nick Gabaldon was also recognized on this marker, and he was the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican descent in the Santa Monica Bay. Gabaldon and other African Americans' actions to use this and other beaches embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure space to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long freedom rights struggle. In June 2019, this same area was honored with a listing as the Bay Street Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service for the significance in the African American experience in US history. This is the first historic district in Santa Monica to receive this national honor. The Santa Monica Conservancy honored Michael Blum of the Sea of Clouds organization and myself with the 2020 Cultural Landscape Award for our work of accomplishing this National Register listing. At recreation and relaxation spaces, despite white racism in ethnically diverse Los Angeles, which was most consistently targeted at African Americans, the landmark designations infuse a cultural and natural resource site with complexities of human history and experiences, offering a critical dimension beyond beauty, rarity, and environmental protection, which strengthens both the heritage and nature conservation movement. From a social and environmental justice viewpoint, the inclusion of this history is symbolic of important social changes which have occurred in some ways. Landmarking of this Santa Monica site pushes forth a sense of collective cultural belonging and a common membership in American society that helps in forming a basis for social progress and action in the future. As a public historian, I have led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica's historic sites through public programming partnerships between the Santa Monica Conservancy, Heal the Bay, the Black Surfers Collective, Surf Academy, Los Angeles County Supervisors, the California Historical Society, and other groups. The benefit of ongoing investment in pluralistic heritage and nature education through these partnerships is important to continue building future pathways to new, wider, and younger audiences, as well as established audiences in support of heritage and nature conservation ideals. This programming, such as Nick Gabaldon Day, International Coastal Cleanup Day, and field trips for youngsters from South Los Angeles, actively connect diverse publics to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history, social action, beach access issues, ocean life, and watershed stewardship intersecting with beach recreation. The nature conservation movement's engagement of broader and more culturally inclusive audiences is enhanced by developing the cultural and historical heritage of nature sites, such as the Bay Street Beach that I've discussed today, and they reach to specific audiences and align with community values. Supporters of both heritage and nature conservation objectives must include the language of injustice, discrimination, inequity, and racism in the discussions to acknowledge the continuing struggle to totally dismantle these conditions, which in many places, more places than some want to recognize, continue to inhibit communities of color from full civic participation, human experiences, and civil society entitlements. I made a presentation to the California Coastal Commission early in 2019 to back their efforts to enact a social and environmental justice policy, which includes this language and the recognition of the history and current conditions of disenfranchised communities to create a policy towards a more fully realized vision of coastal protection and access for all people to enjoy the state's coastline. As part of the California Coastal Commission's policy mandate, the city of Santa Monica was asked to develop an educational program to teach the public about the history of the African Americans who lived and worked in the South Santa Monica neighborhoods around the Civic Center prior to the urban renewal projects that displaced their community. Interpretive history text panels, a permanent art installation, grade school lesson plans, and other education and information programming, including a website, will bring this area's history to life for the present and for future generations. New energy has arisen to reclaim the important history of the Jim Crow era African American beach site at Bay Street as a site of conscience and reflection at this time when racial inequities have been laid bare. In the last few months, the Bay Street Beach has been the event site of a memorial for George Floyd and for Breonna Taylor. The surfing community held paddle outs to celebrate the lives of Floyd and Taylor, looking to call attention to the social justice issues of the day with these events. Like many white Americans, Black Americans were lured to California for its opportunities and the good life imagery produced by writers, painters, photographers, and movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and history surrounding the Western migration published in the last 50 years. The intersection of the stories in my book and the public process activities I have discussed for education, remembrance of our collective history, cultural identity, and stewardship action offer new ways to connect people with natural, cultural, and historical heritage and encourage visitation to these locations and others around the US. As a historian, I have and will continue to firmly engage in encouraging people to use history for broader educational programs, for wider equity and access for all people for enjoyment of the California coastline and other American cultural and natural places now and in the future. I hope you will take time to learn about these forgotten Black Western pioneers and their undertakings and ponder the implications of their stories for our lives today by buying my book and reading it, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Thank you.
Alison, thank you. Wonderful presentation. We really appreciated having you and hearing you. You talked certainly about Nick Gabaldon and his story. From the book, what are some other sort of compelling figures that stand out for you of folks who were important to reclaiming those leisure spaces during the Jim Crow era?
Well, La Bonita was a early establishment that catered to servicing African American needs for a bathhouse in Santa Monica because during the early part of the century, people would come fully clothed to the beach, and then they would go to bathhouses and change their clothes. And so this place was right around the area of where for those who are Santa Monica residents, the La Bonita was right in the area where the Civic Auditorium is right now. And it was on the street called Belmar Place. And so that place was really important from its founding in around 1914 all the way to the 1950s. It had different business configurations over that time period. It started out as a place that could provide, changing space. They had meals. They also had accommodations that could be either short-term or extended stay. And then later in the century, it evolved into being a bar, and the accommodations, the residential accommodations, turned into single apartments rather than being hotelish. So the folks that ran that place, they were really very important from the standpoint of providing a safe place for African Americans to come and change their clothes and, have a meal and then go to the beach. Also, Reverend James A. Stout, who was the first minister at Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, he was very important because of the fact that that institution was the first not only spiritual center for African Americans, but institutional center that provided a meeting place that African Americans could use comfortably. And if you were coming out to Santa Monica to go to the beach, then if you had to, you could go knock on the church door, the parsonage door, and say, I need to use your bathroom in the building. So it was another place of accommodation, making African Americans feel welcome in the area. It was the first church of the CME denomination on the West Coast. They were following where people were moving from the South. And for this church, this denomination to pick Santa Monica, they were looking at what everybody else was looking at. Oh, let's have a, beach resort development. Just as the Methodist Church in the East, in Rehoboth Beach and Martha's Vineyard, developed resorts. And those resorts were an outgrowth of revival meetings that happened in those places. And then even the General Methodist Church had revivals off Temescal Canyon in the Palisades. So, and then there was a gentleman, Walter Gordon, who had a business early on in Santa Monica, cleaning business. He came to Santa Monica around the turn of the 20th century, and he had this business in Santa Monica for like 10 years. And he also worked with Arthur Reese, and Arthur Reese was the first African American to buy a house in Venice. The big other people would be, I mentioned them, Darden and Houston, because that beach business, the resort that they were unable to build, was very important at the time, and all the things that went on around it in terms of the Santa Monica Bay Protective League forming to keep the African Americans from having this beach resort there. There was also a nightclub, which I didn't talk about in the presentation, Caldwell's, which was in the area where the Civic Center was. They forced them to close because it was really successful. They said they didn't want to have dancing in a residential neighborhood. Well, the reason why the place was there is because most likely Caldwell couldn't get a piece of property in the beach area where all the other dance halls were. So he got property where he could, and it was successful. And the white business people didn't like that because, one, they couldn't control, this is going into the psychology of white supremacy. They couldn't control these people having recreational activities. Now, white folks might have been of the same class having those kinds of activities in another place, and the power structure might not have had the same reaction, but they couldn't control this situation. So they put Caldwell out of business. And this was all happening around the same time that the African-American businessmen were trying to build this resort at the end of Pico.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that really struck me about today's talk and then about the article that I read in the Times on Sunday was, you know, the systematic exclusion of African Americans from strategic real estate development and business ownership, the impact that that had on generational wealth in those communities. Like, what a tragedy.
Yes, yes. So for those of you that may not know, the LA Times did an article about Bruce's Beach, which is in Manhattan Beach. And that was an early African-American resort community down there between 26th and 27th off Highland. And it's been in the news a lot lately. So with that, yes, same thing in Santa Monica. When they wouldn't allow the African-Americans to build a beach club there at Pico, that took out wealth development. But they let the white people build a club within 5 years, okay? And that was not the first incident. There was earlier in 1915, other idea of building a resort was foiled. And then even in Santa Monica later, in the 1950s, Silas White bought the old Elks Club building that was on Ocean near Pico, and he was developing that into the Ebony Beach Club. And then he looked up, and the city now is taking his land through eminent domain for a parking lot. Now, they said they needed it for the Civic Center, for the City Hall. Well, it was kind of far from the City Hall at that time to have parking. And then a few years later in the 60s, they allowed that hotel to be built. It's the Viceroy now, but it was something else then. I want to say it was Holiday Inn, but it may not have been. I can't remember. But they allowed a hotel to be built. That's still city-owned land. It's leased. So that is another later in the century economic development opportunity where African Americans were sabotaged, because all of this was sabotage.
Yeah. Well, for stories about pioneers who came here to Santa Monica and to the Santa Monica Bay Area and to Southern California, you should buy Alison's book. We're going to take some questions. Deborah Myers says thank you, and asks and says that she's looking forward to reading your book. Good. And asks if you can say more about the drama around the denial of African-American development of the Casa del Mar site.
So there was all kinds of stuff. They had a lease buyback deal. That's what it was. Culver owned the property, and he sold it to the African Americans. It had been vacant for a long time, and he sold it to the African Americans in this lease buyback deal. And they were looking to build a big resort there that was going to have some amusements as well as a hotel potentially. And when the big white developers, Bundy and some others, got hold of it, and the Santa Monica Bay Protective League was formed. They went to the city council and told them that they didn't want the Black people to build this resort. 500 people showed up at a city council meeting in the 1920s, okay? To say white people, that they didn't want the Black people to build this resort. So then what they did was they changed the zoning so that it said, where it said, you know, it didn't say that you couldn't build a resort, you could do whatever you wanted with it. They changed it to say that you could only build a house on the land. And so they frustrated the African Americans who were, you know, trying to build a resort. So they eventually just let go of the land. And then once they were not involved anymore, then it was sold eventually in the 24 to the Casa del Mar. And then they changed the ordinances again with Casa del Mar's request to allow them to build the Casa del Mar Beach Club. And then they also allowed for the building of the Edgewater Club before 1930. And there was all kinds of stuff that was in the newspapers at the time. I showed some of the headlines. It was interesting to just look at those narratives of why they didn't want the African Americans to have this land for the resort. But there were a couple of articles in the Santa Monica paper as well. And so we don't really have a whole lot of information about it. I actually know descendants of Norman O. Houston. Norman O. Houston went on to found the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company and had other business ventures that he was successful in. And he had some others that he was not so successful in around resort development as well. He comes up in some of the other stories in my book. I think it just kind of got lost, you know, in terms of history. And unfortunately, in terms of African-American history, it hasn't been as documented. It hasn't been documented as well as some other histories in California.
Michelle Renish asks if you can talk about some of the photographs in your book and what it was like researching and finding them.
Well, I started on this research in like 2004, 2005, and so I had the photographs that were in the Shades of LA collection as the first ones that I was able to find. And then as I started doing my research, because I do have some private collection photographs in the book, I was able to, through the people that I was interviewing, find some other photographs. And then not so much for Santa Monica, but some of the other sites, other collections became more available because of our changing nature of how we're communicating information. And so I was able to find in these other collections that maybe I might not have been able to, public collections that I might not have been able to find the photographs 10 years ago. I could find them now because the collections were more available. I did early on find a couple of things in the Santa Monica collection at the museum, but they weren't necessarily on the beach. It just was kind of that the Masons had donated a couple of photographs to the museum, and those are some fabulous photographs. One of them is in front of Phillips Chapel. The photographs are hard to find. All of them, they're just hard to find. And it's now, for me, a lot of private collection looking, if I find any new things.
Looks like we got one more. Ann Weber, thank you for your excellent talk. Can you talk about Bruce's Beach and what the chances for reparations to the existing relatives might look like? Well,
you know, they're working on that. So I I think they should work on that. I'm more interested myself right now in educating the city about the incorrect information that has been passed around and getting the plaque redone so that it reflects the correct information. They have a plaque that commemorates or that recognizes the history, but it's all screwed up. And they put that plaque in 2007. And I was around for some of the hearings at the time, and they rushed through and they didn't hire any experts to help them. And that's why it's all messed up. It's one of the things that inspired me to go to graduate school, to get the Ph.D. I was working on a master's in heritage conservation at that time. I was looking at the stories that I was interested in around African American history. So as part of that process, that allowed me to do the really in detail research that I needed to do to understand the Bruce's Beach history. And so with that, I also learned about public history in that, and I learned about, in terms of public history, you know, there have been monuments that have been put up over the years, and then they got reinterpreted. And so we're in that whole period right now where many things are getting reinterpreted. And so hopefully, in terms of Manhattan Beach, that will happen also. And as far as the question directly about reparations, I think that the community needs to do, and the relatives need to do what they think is beneficial to them and the collective. I'm not involved in that. I know about it and I know the people that are involved, but as a historian and doing the things that I am doing, I'm empathetic to the fact that that it was a sabotage situation for all those families in that community that lost their vacation homes and lost and were sabotaged in terms of economic development opportunities for themselves at that point in time and for future generations.
Looks like we got one more. Lucy Padilla says, thank you. Hi, Lucy. What do you enjoy most about Santa Monica now?
Oh, I love going to the beach. So I love going to the beach. I don't get to the beach as often as I would like, but when I'm in my more leisurely mode, I go to the beach at least once a week. I'm not necessarily sitting on the beach, but I go do my power walking and that kind of thing.
Well, Alison, thank you. Truly great presentation. We really appreciate you doing this. Really appreciate having you. And we do hope you'll join us again so we can hear about Del Mar and any number of other things. Really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. And thank you, everyone. Thanks for buying into this over the last 6 weeks. Look, we're brand new to presenting programs virtually. This is a first go for us. So we really appreciate your support over the last several weeks. We've gotten so much good feedback. So thank you. Follow us on social media. That's where you can get information on everything Santa Monica History Museum and everything that we're planning. This series is going to come back in the fall. We don't have a date yet, but check out our website, subscribe to our email newsletter, follow us on social, and you'll find out all of the information in the fall. Alison's told us she's coming back. I know some of our other great speakers would like to come back as well, and we're excited to host them again. And so we do hope that we'll see you. So until the fall, thank you so much. Thank you to Alison Rose Jefferson. Thank you to all of our speakers. My unending thanks to you, our audience. Thank you.